Last Tuesday, my world imploded on a $300 white linen tablecloth in one of Chicago's most prestigious restaurants. My mother-in-law, Eleanor Evans, a woman who values her social standing more than oxygen, was staring at me with a look of pure, cold disgust. My own mother, Linda, was performing the act of a lifetime, sobbing into a silk handkerchief and telling everyone at the table that I had been secretly draining my parents' retirement fund for years. My father, Robert, just sat there, nodding solemnly, confirming the lie that I was a thief and a parasite. They were telling my husband, Mark, that the woman he married was a criminal who was only using his family for money. They thought this was the final blow. They thought they were finally kicking me out of the Evans family so they could take my place. They had no idea I was about to turn their sad story into a public execution of their own lies. But before I tell you how I reached into my bag and dropped $45,000 worth of truth on that table, I want to ask you a question. Where are you watching this story from right now? And what time is it where you are? I read every single comment, and I love seeing how far these stories reach, so please let me know in the comments below. Also, if you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow and keep bringing these stories to life. Now, let's get back to it. My name is Chloe Miller. I'm 30 years old, and for 5 years, I was the secret ATM for my parents' failing lives. I had spent exactly $45,000 of my own hard-earned money to save their home and fund my golden child brother's mistakes. I kept it a secret to protect their pride. But when I finally stopped the cash flow, they didn't just get angry, they went for my throat. They tried to destroy my marriage to cover their greed. They had no idea I'd kept every single receipt. To understand why I stood in that restaurant with a folder full of receipts, you have to understand the house I grew up in. We lived in a decent suburb of Chicago, a place with manicured lawns and the kind of quiet streets where you'd think nothing bad ever happened. But inside our four walls, a hierarchy was established before I could even walk. There was my brother, Brandon, the golden child, and then there was me, Chloe, the shadow. I remember being 7 years old. It was Brandon's 10th birthday. My parents, Robert and Linda, had spent weeks planning this grand event. They rented out an entire local sports complex, hired a magician, and bought a cake so large it barely fit through the door. I saw the receipt on the kitchen counter. They'd spent over $1,000 on a single afternoon for him. 3 months later, it was my birthday. I remember waking up excited, thinking maybe this year would be different. My mom handed me a box from a local thrift store. Inside was a pair of used roller skates, the previous owner's name, Sarah, still scrawled in permanent marker on the side. When I asked why Brandon got a stadium party and I got Sarah's old skates, my mother didn't even look up from her coffee. She just said, "Brandon is the eldest, Chloe. He's more social. You're the quiet one. You wouldn't have enjoyed a party anyway." That was the theme of my life. Chloe wouldn't want it anyway. It was a way for them to justify giving Brandon everything while I settled for the scraps. By the time we reached high school, the gap became a canyon. On Brandon's 16th birthday, my father pulled a silver Honda Accord into the driveway. It wasn't brand new, but it was clean, reliable, and it was his. 4 months later, when I turned 16, I asked when I'd get to practice for my license. My dad just laughed and said, "You can share with Brandon." But Brandon was never home. He was at football practice, at friends' houses, or just out driving because he needed his freedom. I spent 2 years walking 1.5 miles to school in the Chicago wind and rain, my shoes soaking wet in the hallways, while Brandon's car sat in the student parking lot just a few yards away. But the real betrayal, the one that set the stage for the $45,000 theft, happened during my senior year. I had worked 3 part-time jobs since I was 15. I saved every penny. I wanted to go to the University of Michigan for nursing. I had the grades, I had the drive, and I thought I had a college fund. My grandfather had left $50,000 for his grandchildren's education. I'd seen the paperwork once as a kid. When the acceptance letter came, I sat my parents down at that same oak kitchen table. I got in, I told them, my heart racing. I checked the tuition, and with the fund Grandpa left, I can make this work. My mother wouldn't look me in the eye. My father cleared his throat. Chloe, we need to be realistic, he said. Brandon is already at the state college. His tuition is expensive, and he's struggling with some personal expenses. We had to use the fund. The whole fund? I whispered. That was for both of us. Brandon is an engineer, Chloe, my mother snapped. He's going to make real money. It's just a job. You can take out loans. You're the strong one. You've always been independent. Brandon needs the extra help. It's what family does. And there it was. The family card. It was only played when I was the one expected to sacrifice. I realized then that my parents didn't see me as a daughter. They saw me as a support system for their favorite child. I took out the loans. I worked 40 hours a week while carrying a full nursing load. I survived on ramen and coffee while my parents posted photos of Brandon's spring break trips to Florida, trips paid for with the money that was supposed to be my education. I graduated with $35,000 in debt, while Brandon graduated with zero. He also graduated with a sense of entitlement that would eventually ruin us all. My parents taught him that he could fail, and someone else, usually me, would pay the bill. They called me strong and capable, not as a compliment, but as an excuse to ignore my needs. Chloe doesn't need help. She's a rock, they'd tell the relatives. Meanwhile, they were secretly siphoning Brandon's bad decisions into my bank account before I even knew how to say no. By the time I met Mark, I was a successful nurse, but I was still the girl who walked in the rain. I was so desperate for a real family that I didn't see my own parents preparing to use my new marriage as their next gold mine. They saw Mark's family, the Evanses, and they didn't see love. They saw a bigger ATM, and they expected me to be the one to hand them the card. I became a nurse because I wanted to save people. I wanted to be the person who walked into a room and made things better. But the irony is, while I was busy saving strangers in the ICU, I was being bled dry by the people who shared my DNA. It didn't happen all at once. Greed is like a slow-growing cancer. It starts small, almost invisible, and by the time you notice it, it's already consumed everything. 3 months after I got my RN license and started my first job at a major hospital in downtown Chicago, my mother, Linda, called me. Her voice was different. Soft, shaky, like she'd been crying for hours. "Chloe," she whispered, "the bank sent a notice. Your father's hours at the plant were cut and we're behind on the mortgage. They're threatening to take the house." I didn't know who else to call. I was 22 years old, making more money than I'd ever seen in my life, and I was filled with a sudden, desperate urge to be the hero. I sent her $3,000 that afternoon. It was my entire savings. I told myself it was a one-time thing. I told myself that family takes care of family. I didn't realize I had just opened a tap that would never be turned off. Within 6 months, the emergencies became a monthly subscription. It was always something. The furnace broke in the dead of winter. Robert needed a root canal. The car's transmission died on the way to the grocery store. And then there was Brandon. My golden child brother had decided he was an entrepreneur. He didn't want a boring 9-to-5 job like me. He wanted to build an empire. The only problem was that his empire was built on a foundation of my overtime shifts. Every time Brandon had a brilliant business idea, a luxury car wash, a crypto trading bot, a boutique clothing line, my parents were the ones who pitched it to me. "He just needs a little seed money, Chloe," my father would say, leaning over that same oak kitchen table. "He's going to be big. He'll pay you back with interest. You're doing so well you won't even miss it." I missed it. I missed out on vacations my friends were taking. I missed out on buying a reliable car for myself, sticking with an old clunker that shook every time I hit 50 miles. I was working 60, sometimes 80 hours a week. I lived in the hospital. I became the queen of the night shift because the differential pay was higher. I'd finish a 12-hour shift, my feet throbbing, my head spinning, and I'd check my phone to find a text from Linda. Brandon's rent is due and he's short $800. Can you help? Don't let your brother end up on the street. They knew exactly which buttons to push. They weaponized my empathy and turned it against me. Then I met Mark. Mark was everything my family wasn't: stable, transparent, and incredibly protective of me. His family, the Evanses, were wealthy, yes, but they were also incredibly disciplined. When Mark proposed, I felt a wave of terror. I loved him, but I was terrified that if he knew the truth about my parents, he'd see me as a liability. I'd seen it in his eyes when he talked about financial infidelity. To him, keeping secrets about money was the ultimate betrayal. So, I made a choice. A terrible, exhausting choice. I decided to keep my family's demands a secret. For the first 3 years of our marriage, I operated like a professional money launderer. I kept a separate bank account that Mark didn't know about. I funneled my overtime pay and my yearly bonuses into that account, and from there, it disappeared into the bottomless pit of my parents' greed. I felt like a spy in my own home. Every time a thank you text came from my mother, I had to delete it immediately. Every time I had a conversation with my father about Brandon's latest legal trouble or debt issue, I did it in the hospital parking lot or the grocery store, away from Mark's ears. The numbers started to pile up. $2,000 for the property taxes they forgot to pay. $5,000 for Brandon's lawyer after he got into a fender bender without insurance. The $200 for a new refrigerator because Linda couldn't live like a peasant. I started printing out the transfer receipts and hiding them in a locked folder at the bottom of my gym bag. I told myself I was doing it for tax purposes, but deep down, I think I was keeping a record for the day I finally broke. I needed to see the physical proof of my own exploitation. By the time I sat down and did the math 4 months ago, I nearly fainted. I had transferred exactly $45,000 to my parents over a 5-year period. $45,000. That was a down payment on a house. That was a college fund for a future child. That was my freedom. And what did I have to show for it? My parents still lived in that drafty house. Robert still complained about his bad back while refusing to work, and Brandon was currently driving a car that cost more than mine, a car that I had indirectly paid for by covering his insurance and gas for years. The manipulation was so subtle. They'd invite me over for dinner, and Linda would make my favorite pot roast. For 20 minutes, it felt like a real family, but as soon as the plates were cleared, the tone would shift. "We're so proud of you, Chloe," Robert would say, patting my hand. "You're the strong one. You're the rock. Not like Brandon. He's so sensitive. He's struggling to find his way. He needs a sister who believes in him." They'd frame my financial abuse as a compliment. If I ever questioned where the money was going, Linda would start crying. "I didn't think my own daughter would keep a tally of her parents' survival," she'd sob. "After everything we did for you, this is how you treat us? Like we're strangers asking for a handout?" They made me feel like the villain for wanting to keep my own paycheck. They made me feel like I owed them for the basic act of raising me. I was trapped in a cycle of repayment for a debt I never signed up for. And all the while, Mark was planning our future, talking about buying a vacation home or investing in a portfolio, and I was sitting there, nodding and smiling, knowing that my secret $45,000 hole was growing deeper every month. I was waiting for the day I could say no. I was waiting for the day they'd push me just an inch too far, and that day was coming faster than any of us realized. When I met Mark, I didn't see a bank account. I saw a lighthouse. I was a woman who had spent a decade navigating the choppy, unpredictable waters of my parents' emotional and financial demands, and Mark was the first person who offered me a solid place to land. He was a high-end architect, the kind of man who measured twice and cut once, and that precision extended to his soul. He was honest to a fault. The first time he took me to meet his mother, Eleanor Evans, at their family estate in Lake Forest, I felt like an imposter. The Evans family didn't live in a house. They lived in a legacy. The floors were reclaimed oak, the art on the walls was older than my grandparents', and the silence in the hallways wasn't the heavy, tense silence of my childhood. It was the quiet of security. Eleanor was a formidable woman. She wore pearls not as jewelry, but as armor. She looked at me with those sharp gray eyes, assessing whether I was a builder or a taker. At the time, I was terrified she'd see the cracks my parents had left in me. I didn't realize that she would eventually become the very person who would help me shatter the lies my parents had spent 30 years weaving. The trouble started the moment my parents, Robert and Linda, found out who Mark was. I remember the night I told them. We were at a cheap diner near their house, my treat, as always. My mother's eyes didn't light up with happiness for her daughter's love. They lit up with the cold, calculating glint of a predator who had just spotted a larger prey. "An Evans?" she whispered. "The Lake Forest Evans family? The ones who own the development firm?" "Yes, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice small, "but he's just Mark to me." "Oh, he's never just an Evans, Chloe," my father added. "Think of the connections. Think of what this could do for Brandon. Your brother has been looking for a real break in the real estate market. This is perfect." That was the first red flag I ignored. They didn't ask if he was kind to me. They didn't ask if I was happy. They only asked if his family was useful. The merger dinner, the first time our families met, was a disaster disguised as a formal event. It was held at a private club that Eleanor belonged to. I remember sitting there, my stomach in knots, watching my mother perform. She wore a dress she'd begged me to buy her for the occasion, $450 from a boutique she couldn't afford, and she spent the entire night playing the role of the sacrificing, humble mother. "We've had to make so many sacrifices to give Chloe the life she has," Linda said, her voice dripping with fake humility. "Nursing school was so expensive, and we wanted her to have the best. We've always put our children first, haven't we, Robert?" Robert nodded solemnly, sipping a wine that cost more than his monthly grocery bill. "Always. We're simple people, Eleanor, but we believe in family loyalty above all else." I sat there, my face burning, thinking about the $45,000 I had already funneled into their bank accounts. I thought about the 80-hour shifts, the bus rides in the rain, and the student loans I was still paying off while they sat there taking credit for my existence. I saw Eleanor watching them. She was polite, but I could see the gears turning. She was a woman who understood money, and she was starting to smell the desperation coming off my parents in waves. As the wedding planning began, the jealousy became a poison. My parents were obsessed with the Evans wealth. They'd call me every night, not to check on me, but to complain about their shabby life compared to what I was entering. "Must be nice," my mother would sneer, "planning a wedding at the Fairmont while your father and I are worried about the property taxes. I guess you've outgrown us, Chloe. You're an Evans now. You don't have time for the people who raised you." It was a trap. Every time they made me feel guilty, I'd write another check. $1,500 for a dental emergency. $2,000 to help Brandon with his car insurance. I was trying to buy their silence. I was trying to pay a guilt tax so they wouldn't embarrass me in front of Mark's family. I wanted to belong to the Evans world, a world where people said what they meant and didn't use love as a weapon. But my parents saw my new life as an insult. Every luxury I enjoyed with Mark was something they felt entitled to. They started dropping hints to Mark's parents about how struggling they were. They were setting the stage. They were painting me as the ungrateful daughter who had made it big and left her poor, aging parents in the dust. The most painful part was seeing Mark try to be kind to them. He'd offer to help with small repairs at their house, and they'd turn it into a request for a loan. He'd invite them to dinner, and they'd spend the whole time talking about how lucky I was to have escaped my difficult upbringing. They were slowly, systematically poisoning the well. They were making Mark feel like he was my savior, and making his family believe that I was someone who turned her back on her own blood. I lived in constant fear. I was a bridge between two worlds that couldn't coexist. One built on the solid rock of discipline and truth, and the other built on the shifting sands of greed and manipulation. I thought if I just gave them enough money, they'd be satisfied. I didn't realize that for people like Robert and Linda, enough is a destination that doesn't exist. They didn't just want the Evans money, they wanted to destroy the one thing I had that they never would: a family that actually loved me. The breaking point didn't come with a bang. It came with a phone call on a rainy Tuesday evening while I was finishing my shift at the hospital. I was exhausted, my scrubs felt like lead, and all I wanted was to go home to Mark. Then my phone buzzed. It was my mother, Linda. Usually I'd ignore it, but the family emergency light on my phone, the one I'd set specifically for them, was flashing. "Chloe," she sobbed the second I picked up. "It's Brandon. He's in trouble. Real trouble this time." My heart didn't race. It sank. It was the same script they'd been reading for years. Brandon had gotten into another misunderstanding with a debt collector over a luxury car he couldn't afford, and he needed $10,000 by Friday or he was going to lose everything. "I don't have $10,000, Mom," I said, my voice flat. "Don't lie to me, Chloe." Her voice shifted from sobbing to a sharp, jagged edge in an instant. "We saw the photos of your anniversary trip to Aspen. You're living in a mansion in Lake Forest. Mark has millions. 10,000 is pocket change for people like you now. That money belongs to Mark's family, and my salary is already tapped out from the 45,000 I've given you over the last 5 years." I replied. "I'm done. I am not paying for Brandon's mistakes anymore. He's 27. Let him figure it out." The silence on the other end was deafening. Then, my father's voice came onto the line. He'd been listening on the other extension. "You listen to me, you ungrateful girl," Robert hissed. "We sacrificed everything for you. We gave you a home, we put food in your mouth, and this is how you repay us? By letting your brother rot while you sit in your ivory tower? If you don't send that money, I will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are. I'll go to Eleanor myself." "Is that a threat, Dad?" I asked. My hands were shaking from a rage so deep I felt it in my bones. "It's a promise," he replied. I hung up. I sat in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes. I realized then that my parents didn't love me. They loved the version of me that was useful to them. I was a tool, a resource to be mined until I was empty. They were willing to destroy my marriage, my reputation, and my peace of mind just to protect the golden child who had never worked a day in his life. That night, I went home and did something I should have done years ago. I pulled out the manila folder. I spent 4 hours organizing every single bank transfer, every emergency text message, and every Venmo receipt. I made copies. I put them in a professional binder. I was no longer the scared girl trying to buy her parents' affection. I was a nurse who knew how to document a wound, and this wound was $45,000 deep. 2 days later, I saw a text from my mother. It wasn't an apology. It was a photo of them at a high-end cafe, and the caption read, "Lunch with Eleanor today. She was so shocked to hear about your financial struggles and the money you borrowed from us." They had done it. They had gone nuclear. They thought that by lying to my mother-in-law, they could force me into submission. They had no idea that they hadn't just started a fire. They had handed me the extinguisher and the fuel. I called Mark and told him we needed to talk to his mother. The dinner was set for Tuesday, the same dinner where they planned to bury me. The smear campaign didn't take weeks. It took hours. My parents, Robert and Linda, were professionals at playing the victims. They knew that if they simply asked for money, people might judge them. But if they framed their greed as concern for their daughter, they could mobilize an entire army against me. By Wednesday morning, my phone was a graveyard of notifications. But it wasn't just my parents anymore. It was the flying monkeys, the extended family members and family friends my mother had recruited to do her dirty work. I received a text from my Aunt Patricia that made my blood run cold. It said, "Chloe, how could you, after everything your parents did for you, to hear that you've been stealing from their retirement fund and calling Eleanor an old bag with a fat checkbook is just sick. You need to get help." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. They weren't just asking for money anymore. They were rewriting my entire character. They had called Eleanor Evans and delivered a performance that deserved an Oscar. They told her that I had a secret gambling problem and that I had been siphoning money from their accounts to pay off debts in the city. They claimed that the only reason I married Mark was because I saw the Evans estate as my ultimate payout. The genius of their lie was that it explained why I was always so stressed and why I worked so much overtime. They turned my hard work into erratic behavior and my financial support of them into theft. They weaponized the very thing I did to save them, the $45,000, and told Eleanor that they were the ones who had to pay me to keep me out of trouble. When I got home that evening, the air in our house was thick with a silence that felt like a physical weight. Mark was sitting in the living room, his head in his hands. He looked up at me, and for the first time in our marriage, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "My mom called," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She's distraught, Chloe. Your parents told her you've been borrowing thousands of dollars from them and that you've made some really ugly comments about our family's wealth. They said you're mentally unstable and that we should consider postponing our future plans until you get professional help." "And you believe them?" I asked. My heart was breaking right there on the hardwood floor. "I don't know what to believe," Mark snapped, standing up. "You've been so secretive lately. You're always at the hospital. You're always hiding your phone. Why didn't you tell me they were helping you financially? Why did I have to hear it from my mother?" They had done exactly what they intended. They had isolated me. By painting me as a thief and a liar, they ensured that any truth I told would be seen as a desperate cover-up. They were the predators, but the whole world now saw them as the grieving, heartbroken parents of a wayward daughter. I looked at Mark, and I realized that if I tried to explain it now, it would just sound like more instability. I needed to wait for the dinner. The venue was a private dining room at the Signature Room, overlooking the glittering skyline of Chicago. It was supposed to be a celebration of Eleanor and her late husband's legacy, a 40th anniversary dinner in his honor. The room was filled with 20 of the most influential people in Mark's circle, cousins who were CEOs, family friends who sat on hospital boards, and the local elite. In the middle of it all sat my parents, Robert and Linda, looking like two mournful saints who had been forced to share a table with a sinner. The air was so thick with tension I could barely swallow my water. Mark was sitting next to me, his body rigid, his eyes avoiding mine. Every time I reached for his hand, he subtly moved it to adjust his napkin. My mother was across from us, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, leaning over to whisper to Eleanor. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew the script. She was likely reminding Eleanor of my gambling debts, or how I had stolen from their retirement fund. Halfway through the main course, Eleanor clinked her crystal glass with a silver spoon. The room went silent. I expected a toast. Instead, she looked directly at me with a gaze that could have frozen the lake outside. "Before we continue," Eleanor began, her voice carrying that effortless authority, "I believe in integrity. The Evans name stands for honesty, and it has come to my attention that we have allowed a predator into our midst." A collective gasp rippled through the table. My father looked down at his plate, the perfect image of a man burdened by his daughter's shame. "Chloe," Eleanor said, her voice rising so the waitstaff could hear it, "your parents have been incredibly brave to come to me. They told me how you've been bleeding them dry, stealing their retirement, and lying to this family about your intentions. You are a thief, Chloe. You've used my son, you've used your parents, and you have disgraced this table. I want you to stand up, leave this room, and never step foot in an Evans property again. Mark, tell her." Mark didn't look at me. He just whispered, "Maybe you should go, Chloe." I didn't move. I didn't cry. I simply reached for my tote bag on the floor and pulled out the manila folder. The room held its breath. My mother's eyes widened. She thought I was going to beg. She had no idea the execution was about to begin. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just looked at Eleanor, then at my mother, who was still dabbing at her dry eyes with a performance of fake grief. "You want me to leave because I'm a thief?" I asked. my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Then let's look at the receipts. I reached into my bag and slammed the leather binder onto the table. The sound made my father jump. I flipped it open to the first page, a certified bank statement from 5 years ago. November 2019, $3,000 for a mortgage payment you forgot to make, Mom. I flipped the page. July 2021, $5,000 for Brandon's lawyer. I kept flipping, the paper snapping. Eleanor leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the official stamps and my parents' names as beneficiaries. This isn't my debt, Eleanor. These are the records of every single dollar I sent them to keep their house from foreclosure. It totals exactly $45,080. I didn't drain their retirement fund. I was their retirement fund. I looked at my mother. Her face was no longer pale. It was gray. She knew the performance was over. I wasn't the parasite in this family. They were. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of my mother's ragged breathing. Eleanor Evans stood up slowly, her pearls catching the dim light of the restaurant. She didn't look at me. She looked at Robert and Linda. I have spent 40 years protecting the reputation of this family, she said, her voice a low, terrifying hum. And in 40 minutes, you two have shown me a level of depravity I didn't think existed in people who call themselves parents. You lied to me. You tried to use me as a weapon against your own child because she wouldn't fund your failures anymore. She gestured to the door. Get out. If I ever see either of you or your pathetic son near my family or my properties again, I will use every legal resource I have to ensure you spend the rest of your lives in a courtroom. Leave. Now. My parents didn't look at me. They didn't apologize. They just scurried out like the parasites they had become. Mark reached for my hand, his eyes filled with a regret so deep he couldn't find words for minutes. Chloe, I'm so sorry, he whispered. I should have seen it. I should have known you were carrying all of this. It took time, but I chose peace over performance. I haven't spoken to them since that night. Brandon's car was repossessed 3 weeks later, and my parents had to downsize to a studio apartment. For the first time in 30 years, they have to face the consequences of their own greed. As for me, I'm still a nurse. I still save lives. But I stopped trying to save people who were determined to drown me. My name is Chloe Miller. I kept the receipts, and I am finally, truly free.